What up, folks? Victor Coronado over here alongside Nick Ayala, comrade Nick Ayala. This is a Sons of Fidel production, ANTICONQUISTA production. Please check us out at anticonquista.com. Please like today's program. Please share the content. Please spread the word. Please subscribe as well. Nick, comrade Nick, how we doing, brother?
Doing pretty good, man. How you doing?
I'm doing all right. This is episode 4 of Nuestra America, Nuestra America, or Our America. This is a weekly news roundup where we cover different things that are happening in Latin America. And I apologize to the audience. I am still recovering from an upper respiratory infection, so I cough or I put myself on mute temporarily here and there. I do apologize. So let's get right into it. So let's just cover some of the stuff that's been happening over the past week. Obviously, the big news is Haiti, and we'll get into Haiti in just a second. We'll start off with Mexico. Mexico and the United States reached a deal to allow workers at a General Motors plant the ability to vote on a collective bargaining agreement. This was a weird situation as far as I'm concerned, because it was a Biden administration request of the Mexican government to allow workers the ability to collectively bargain. But that was just something that was in the New York Times, so I figured it was worth mentioning. Moving right along to, I'm not sure if you have any response on that, Nick, before. I mean, it's not really a...
I would be interested to know where that plant is located, in the U.S. or in Mexico?
It's in Mexico.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Which AMLO and their government, they went ahead and moved forward with that pretty quickly. So the big news, obviously, this week, was Haiti. So we're moving on right along to Haiti. President, and I'm like you, Nick. I have trouble pronouncing some of these French names. And I know you had the same issue on the recent program. It's is it Moise? Moise.
Yeah, Moise.
Moise was assassinated on July 7th at his private residence. ANTICONQUISTA provided coverage on the assassination, providing historical context and talking about the aftermath of the assassination on a YouTube Live we did yesterday. And Nick, I got the chance to watch it. I mean, kudos to you and Comrade Carlos and the guests. I mean, that was just a fantastic program. Any thoughts basically on that? I mean, I know it's still in the news, and it's all I've described this as almost like watching a movie, except this is real serious shit. This is real serious stuff that's actually happening, but it's almost like watching a movie in real time.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to give a shout out to Kevin and France from the Haiti Info Project, because they really provided a lot of information that I think a lot of folks didn't know and had no clue around, and they had a lot of good sound bites that I think were really, really important, like the idea that what we're doing and trying to learn about the politics of Haiti, like the current politics of Haiti. And we were talking about this behind the scenes, I think maybe a couple of days ago. A lot of people can discuss, Haiti as a more generic, like Haiti in the abstract sense. Talk about the Haitian Revolution, the important legacy that has, and I think that's important and that's correct to understand that. But part of that being intentional with your solidarity, as I think Kevin was the one who said it, is to know who Claude Joseph is, who is Jovenel Moise, who are these actors in play that are, even if they're on the right wing, even if they're dictators, part of the ultra right, we got to know who they are in order to actually understand the politics, understand what's going on. So I was grateful for them coming on the show and informing us, because I really, I've seen so many different things. I've seen people say the CIA has a hand in this. There's nothing verified that the CIA had a hand in this yet. Maybe, but you can't come out and say things like that. People have said, it's because they Moise was killed because he's rejected the vaccines. People come up with all these crazy conspiracies without understanding what actually is going on. And they put it, I think, the best as I've seen anyone else put it on any other program, which is they said, it's a internal coup. The popular movement of Haiti, the Lavalas movement today came out and said that this was an internal coup where the faction of the right wing party, the PHTK, overthrew another faction of the party. That's what we're seeing. And right now they're competing for favor amongst the U.S. and different factions are competing for trying to win over the U.S. Some are saying that they want intervention, others don't want intervention. It's a whole back and forth, but it's a right wing, it's a internal dispute between the elite, and unfortunately, what we see oftentimes is this spills over into the public, into the masses, and innocent people, civilians get killed.
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was educational, enlightening. What I found refreshing is that all of us are over here at Anticonquista. We're being honest with ourselves in the audience. I've said it. I heard you and Carlos say the same thing, that we as revolutionaries, over here at Anticonquista, we need to do more of this work and make those connections with the right people, with the progressive and revolutionary forces on the ground in Haiti, and then we ourselves need to educate ourselves more as to what's really happening in Haiti. I've heard that from all of us, and so we're not lying to the audience. We're being sincere in that this is a process for us as well, and this is this shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, because this is not stuff that they're going to teach you in the schools. This is not stuff they're going to teach you in the capitalist press. So it's incumbent upon us, revolutionaries who are sincere about this work, to try to do that work, right? Of building the right solidarity projects, if you will, the right connections, and learning about what's not only the history, but what's happening actually right now. And so I thought that was very refreshing, and we're going to continue to do that. So that was my take. I'm gonna continue on reading the headlines unless you wanted to add something else.
Nah, I mean that's mostly. I agree with you. I think too, part of it was like, why do we do this show, like just giving weekly updates on Latin America in terms of what's happening in the news? Well, it's because that's part of our solidarity. That's part of like being intentionally in solidarity with the people who are resisting, is knowing what's going on, and that's something that Amilcar Cabral writes about. He says that very, very directly, that those in the West, those in Europe, those in the U.S., their responsibility is to understand the material conditions in the global South, in the areas that their nations pillaged and exploited, because they have more access to that information, and we do, So this is part of the solidarity, and this is the same thing. This is part of that work. So
I believe that according to the census, now there's 60 million Latinos here in the United States now, roughly. So that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to connect, and we get it, especially with older Latinos who tend to be more conservative, who probably fled political persecution or fled political crisis. They don't want to talk about this stuff, or tend to be just conservative in general, or had the access to leave, even though they had, they may have been from middle or upper class, social strata, and then were able to leave because they could. But the younger folks tend to be more rebellious and not give a fuck, right? And are more curious and inquisitive. So how do we connect a lot of these young Latinos and a good chunk or segment of that Latino population in the diaspora with the global South, with the revolutionary progressive forces that we see in Latin America? And that's part of this whole idea of providing this content, and then not only just providing content, but again, building with solidarity with these groups and these organizations and the peoples of the revolutionary peoples of the South, of the global South. So continuing on with the headlines. Haiti's interim government immediately requested U.S. assistance in the form of troops, which the U.S. ostensibly, or not ostensibly, but in the public eye, rebuffed. However, the FBI and Homeland Security officials will be provided to Haiti. I believe there was, Nick, I believe you shared something with us internally. There were some already planes docked down in Haiti. I forget what, and if you could refresh my memory, do you remember what planes they were?
I forget. They were basically U.S. transport planes. Let me see if I can find out.
All right. While you're doing that, I'll continue on with the headlines. But there were some American planes that were photographed.
Yeah, I found them. C-130s, I believe, which are basically military, like they're transport aircraft. So they were found at the airports. I think, like, what is it? The Toussaint Louverture International.
Right.
And they weren't troops, there, but there were military, like what do they call them? The officers that help give advice and military advisors.
Yeah.
The military advisors touched down in Haiti to meet with some folks. There's that, and then there's also the USS Billings, which is one of the fastest marine transport ships in that the U.S. has, and specifically located in the Caribbean region near Latin America. And it's currently docked in Santo Domingo, so in the DR. The reason it's docked there is probably because if they do if the U.S. decides to intervene, or they request intervention, they could be there in at the drop of a dime.
Right.
So.
Right. Continue on with some of these headlines here. Haiti's interim government also put in an official request to the UN Security Council for troops and security. The UN Security Council would have to vote on such a request. And you folks did an excellent job in touching on the history of the failed history. I mean, this is putting it lightly, of UN security troops being on the ground in Haiti, and some of the atrocities committed by UN security troops.
And that's recent history.
Right. Some other things I found very curious. So Colombia's National Intelligence Directorate and the Intelligence Director for the National Police will be part of an investigation into the assassination, according to Colombian President Iván Duque. And then there was an article in Reuters titled "U.S. Probing American Ties to the Assassination of Haitian President." So again, I agree with you. And in fact, again, internally, these are some I'm going to give the audience some insight here in terms of some of the conversations we've had internally. I'm someone who's very I want evidence and testimonials, right? Because I want to be able to put this stuff together. So we're all waiting on that. We have, I believe it was now 26 allegedly 26 Colombian nationals who were part of the assassination, and 2 Haitian Americans. And if that is true, it's just interesting that Colombia, let's just try to put some of this into context. Colombia wants to send people to investigate their own, and then the U.S. wants to send some people to investigate their own. And the U.S. is an empire, with the closest ally being Colombia in the region. And allegedly, they came through the Dominican Republic, which is also another ally of the U.S. So again, some potential clues without coming out and saying, and obviously we know the history, so we can't dismiss the history. But like you, I am interested to learn what the actual facts and evidence is and what is presented to us. So I'm not sure if you had any other thoughts on that.
Yeah, my only thing with that, I go back again to the program the other day. I really like what Franz said, and he made the point that it was essentially that these guys who they arrested, first of all, there's nothing tying them back. There's no specific evidence or verification that they were the ones who did the assassination. But they were there at the scene. They were, well armed, all that kind of stuff. All what they have right now points to the idea that it was probably them. But another thing that they mentioned, the folks at Haiti Info Project, was that, look, the way to get up to the private residence of Moise is guarded by the nation, the Haiti National Police. So to some extent, the police, and we've seen now that the chief of police started taking these stances against Moise. He started, he quickly sided with the current interim president. He's vying for power. All this, they're playing favors. So it's clear that the police and probably, some other forces who are trying to hide under the radar were part of this assassination, like forces in Haiti specifically. But it's easier to point to foreign outside forces, right, which is something that Franz mentions. He's like, look, they got these light-skinned Spanish-speaking individuals who clearly stand out in Haiti. And yeah, they're going to be easy targets. You just point to them and say, look, these are the guys who did it. They're not from here. So I think that's part of what's going on too, is you have like this scapegoating of the easy targets. And then there's probably forces behind the scenes who are going to try to get away with it. And those forces are probably the ones in power right now. So you know, it's an interesting situation. I don't think all the details will come out probably like with stuff like this, man. Like, you know, the details don't come out for like years.
Right.
It takes forever.
Well, it's clearly you know, and this is in the true sense of the word, a conspiracy, right? You have you know, behind the scenes actors conspiring
Right.
to do something, and there's just a lot of, and then think about this. So to the extent that the U.S. and Colombia may be involved or whatever, along with the Haitian oligarchs, who the fuck knows what's happened? They're all investigating themselves, like, you know. So, you know, yeah. So it's just, you know, it's going to be really difficult to really piece all this stuff together. I have tons of questions which I don't know we're going to get answers to. But yeah. So moving right along to the Dominican Republic, of course, the government of Luis Abinader, which is the Dominican president, has chosen to close down its borders with Haiti, using the Haitian political crisis as a pretext. The political crisis will affect trade with both countries, as they account for nearly $750 million US in total annual trade. Any thoughts, Nick?
No, I mean, this is I think this has been part of the Dominican government, like how they've been acting for centuries now, right? I mean, they've been close allies to the U.S. for a long time. I find it interesting when I was reading this before filming. The first thing I thought of was, again, something that came up from the Haitian program, because you know those guys, they had a lot of gems. But one of the things they mentioned was, unlike the DR, because a lot of comparisons are made between Haiti and the DR. Unlike in the DR, the people don't constitutionally, according to the Constitution, they don't own anything, right? And that's always been the case. We've seen right now there's a big thing happening with the mining corporations in the DR, continuing their exploitation, getting more rights, and that's been you know, that just plays into the idea that a lot of our nations, talking about the DR, not just the DR, not just Haiti, but a lot of our nations are nothing more than just cheap profit markets for transnational corporations. And, you know, those corporations aren't just based in the US. A lot of these mining corporations are based in Canada, the UK, Western Europe, but it's a coalition of imperialists throughout the West who help enforce the I guess the global capitalist market that allows these corporations to exploit our people. So, you know, it's nothing new.
Absolutely.
DR, you know.
Absolutely. In some economic news in the Dominican Republic, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, or ECLAC, is projecting the Dominican economy will increase 5.5% in total GDP in the year 2022. Again, that probably bodes well for the oligarchs. Not so sure how that bodes well for the average Dominican worker or peasant or farmer. In the Dominican Republic as well, LGBTQ activists, and I was in touch with someone who was involved. I'm trying to get more information from her. But LGBTQ activists are taking to social media in attempts to stop discrimination against their community after the country's new penal code states, quote, "There will be no discrimination when the service provider or employer bases the refusal by objection of religious, ethical, moral conscience, or institutional requirements." And so the LGBTQ community has created this online campaign as well as taking to the streets, and it's targeting the Dominican economy as they hashtag don't come to DR until changes are made. So this is a new thing. It's you know, it hasn't really even made its way over here yet, but it's at least in not most circles, but they're trying to get the world's attention with regards to this new penal code.
There's one thing. Oh,
go ahead. No, I was going to just wait for your response, Nick.
Yeah, there was one thing I'll say. There was a group here in New York. I think they're called Dominicans United NYC, and they have been talking a lot about that. I actually originally saw this on something they posted, maybe like yesterday or something. But they're having some actions around NYC, in New York City, in order to basically raise more awareness around this issue, because it's pretty amazing. It's you know, you ever talk to a lawyer that they'll tell you, look, in the U.S. and in many countries, discrimination, some forms of discrimination are legal, right? You can be discriminated against depending on certain conditions. Now, there are some things that you can't be discriminated against: race, sex, age, all that kind of stuff. But here in the DR, what we're seeing is just sort of like that, I guess, that cultural history of Catholicism, right, and religion, playing a more of an emphasis than, I want to say, like basic human rights, right? Like
and nationalism,
right.
Yeah, and then which is clearly it's targeted towards the Haitians,
Right.
So yeah, so on one end, what you just said, and then also, this is purposeful attempt to target Haitians and descendants of Haitian of Haiti.
Yeah.
Lastly, in Dominican news, President Luis Abinader expressed his affinity towards the United States, stating that there are excellent relations between the two countries as they both work towards, quote unquote, strengthening the democratic systems in the region. And I see the smirk on your face. That kind of ties into what you stated earlier. And so just for folks, again, we need to understand and be clear who our potential allies, who our enemies are. And since 1965, essentially, the Dominican ruling class has been governing, purely for the interests of the oligarchs and the wealthy in the Dominican Republic.
What do you know what party Abinader is part of?
Yeah, so basically what happened was, for a long time for many years now, you had basically two major parties. So basically like the Democrats Republican thing, right? Yeah. So you had the PRD and the PLD, Partido Revolucionario Dominicano and el Partido de Liberación Dominicano. So like, so PLD basically had and PLD had it on smash for a long time. Like they were just, you kind of had this back and forth between PLD and PLD, and then PLD just basically had they had a monopoly on Dominican politics for a while. Then there was a split within the PLD. So now Luis, let me see if I can look this I apologize, I'm blanking on the name, but that's the new party that he leads. It basically, let's see here, political affiliation. Give me just a second here, and I'll get that for the audience.
Yeah, because one of the reason I asked is because I remember the last president, Danilo Medina. And he was seen as he was part of a party that was like this liberal, supposedly progressive party, like not a left party, but like that liberal kind of left. And then he was doing the exact same shit that this guy's doing. He was selling out to these big mining corporations, playing a useful role as an ally to the U.S. Wasn't he the one who brought up the idea of building like a fence or a border, or basically putting more troops on the border against Haiti? It is the same crap no matter which side, no matter which party you get.
Yeah, so people know both PLD and PRD were basically, you could say, brainchilds of Juan Bosch. It's ironic because Juan Bosch wasn't a communist or anything like that, but he was considered very progressive, I guess a social democrat. And these parties just became very perverted. The ideologies became very perverted, and you just had all types of weird actors getting involved with these political. I'm giving a summation of this, but yeah. So then they governed the country for like over 2 decades basically. And so, but anyways, Luis Abinader is part of the Modern Revolutionary Party, the PRM, and so. It's according to Wikipedia. Very after new division within, and I'm sorry, I said PLD, I meant PRD, within PRD, which is the other party. So yeah, I mean that's the political party that he belongs to. And again, this is common. Like they're recycling the name. They just rebranding it. And so that's who that joker is. So moving on to Cuba. Let's start off with your thing first, Nick. You want to talk about this SOS Cuba thing that's sort of getting a little bit of traction on the social media platforms?
Yeah. So it was interesting. Just to let the audience know, I guess. So we actually didn't even know too much about this until people started reaching out to us about seeing this SOS Cuba, which has become a trending hashtag, a trending thing, not in social media and in some media outlets. But yeah, the idea is essentially that the Cuban government is ineffective in dealing with the pandemic right now. We're seeing a spike in cases in Cuba, And as well, with the spike of cases, obviously comes the spike in the death toll, overburdened hospitals, etc. And there's all these images of how horrific things are in Cuba right now. And obviously, a lot of this is to do with a media propaganda campaign in order to demonize the Cuban government and make them seem like they are, essentially not doing their job in terms of taking care of the civilians. And it's interesting that this comes, notice when this comes almost 2 years into the coronavirus pandemic. And now that Cuba is suddenly, not able to deal with the problem. And the reason it comes so late is because for those 2 years, Cuba had originally enacted a very strict lockdown, right? Immediately began developing, vaccines, and immediately started deploying doctors all across the world in order to try to fight the pandemic, not only in its own nation, but in other nations as well. I have a friend who's in Havana right now. And I remember when she was telling me that when she went to Cuba, I don't know if you've traveled recently on plane, but here in the U.S., if you're traveling by plane, it's basically like a free, man, you could do anything. Like they don't check you for anything. They don't test you. You don't have to provide evidence of testing or vaccination or none of that. In Cuba, they're extremely strict. Everyone has to have a proof of a negative test. Everyone has to have, proof of at least being negative for a certain amount of days, and then they have to quarantine even if they are negative for a certain amount of days. So it's very strict in terms of letting people in or out and making sure that people, aren't spreading the disease in the country. So this sort of propaganda campaign comes at a time, and you mentioned this, Vic, before we started filming, we were talking this at a time when we're seeing a spread in cases due to these variants like the Delta variant. And of course, that's going to happen because these variants are, first of all, they're more transmissible. They're more, I'm not sure if they're more, I think they're more deadly as well. But also they're harder to fight given the fact that, things were looking up for a little while. People had kind of laxed their restrictions, and then all of a sudden this sort of comes out of nowhere. But at the end of the day, I think, you could probably bring up the next headline, because the next headline, I think, ties in well to what we're talking about here and how we're going to dispel a lot of this propaganda and a lot of these myths, is that, like we said, Cuba right now, Cuban government is developing 5 different vaccines. That next headline you had mentions that one of the vaccines is actually ended up being 92% effective, right?
Pulling that up now, and this is now the second. I'm losing track of how many vaccines these people are coming up with how many vaccines the Cubans are coming up with. But they have this new trial where they basically. So here's the headline. Clinical trials in Cuba show a 91.2 efficacy with 2 doses of Soberana 2 and 1 of Soberana Plus. So basically, what they do is, if I remember correctly, I think so. You take 1 on day 1, or they call it day 0 in the trial, and then I think day 28, and then day 56. And so, and that's the result that you get. And so this is now, I believe, the second clinical trial. This happens to be with this combination, this little mix here. But they have another trial that was with another vaccine that's like 90-something%. And they have another very good, I think, two or three other vaccines that were like 60-something%. Which are still, in the medical community, scientific community, that's like, okay, that's still a very good, effective vaccine, by those standards. But to get 90-something%, I mean, it's ridiculous. That's right up there, right, with a pretty high standard. So but you're not seeing this being hashtag everywhere, right? Right. So it's just, again, to Nick's point, it's just propaganda. There isn't. Nick already laid it out. There isn't another country in the entire region that's done more against the fight of pandemic. Against the fight against this pandemic, right? So, from taking active measures at home, from showing their solidarity all over the world to remote regions in the world, to developing these vaccines under a blockade, with the limited resources that they have, but yet the headline is that now there's a spike. Somehow that should surprise us somehow, because we're still in the middle of this thing. That there's a spike in cases, and there's a slight spike in deaths, and all of a sudden the Cuban government is inadequate and incompetent.
Look at all of these like SOS Cuba post or anyone who's posting this, look at how many of them are talking about the blockade. The first one, when someone who DM'd us on Instagram showed us this one, and I looked at it, and like immediately, first thing I noticed is they don't say a word about the blockade. So they talk about how Cuban government can't afford like all these different materials or resources necessary for them to actually properly distribute the vaccine. That's really what it was talking about. And that whole time, not a word about the fact that the blockade stops Cuba from getting access to things like syringes, which you need in order to distribute a vaccine. You know, they basic everyday things that we take for granted, masks, gloves, you know, things for healthcare professionals in order for them to be safe when distributing the vaccine. That kind of stuff is actually not even like they can't even Cuba can't access it, right? And I saw another thing that is part of this whole propaganda thing, which is like the international community has offered the Cuban government access to these resources, but they've denied it. Well, it's not that the Cuban government has denied it. It's that the international community either A, offers these things with strings attached. So like, you know, open up the government or let us take this resource and we'll give this to you. Or B, the international community is offering it to them, but then the U.S. is the one who's blocking it from actually getting into Cuba. So these are the things that people aren't talking about. And you have now, like, I'll bring it up now, Residente, right, who's become, you know, he's a popular Puerto Rican artist, a part of Calle 13.
Calle 13.
And he, you know, he typically seen as like this progressive who talks about all like the oppression in Latin America, the exploitation of the resources and land and all this kind of stuff. And he's always kind of had, at least in my eyes, like a questionable politics. Because I only say that because I remember in 2018 in Nicaragua when they had those stashes of weapons in the cathedrals and the churches, and they were saying Ortega and the Sandinistas are being repressive against the students and they're cracking down on students. I forget what year that was, but it wasn't too long ago. Residente was there, you know, repeating those same imperialist lies about the Sandinistas and Ortega, and that's kind of just like that's kind of how he's been. He'll call out the right wing, but then he'll also call out like the socialists, and again, it's that stupid kind of conflating the two to try to be the same thing when they're not. But he's joined in on this campaign to talk about SOS Cuba, and it's interesting because look at what he said about it. The first thing he says is SOS Cuba. You know, the Cuban government has been inefficient. All this blah blah blah. Right? People call him out on it, and they said you're not even talking about the blockade. So then he changes his language and he said, "Oh well, it's still the Cuban government is still inefficient, but it's also down with the U.S. blockade." Like, bro, like you can't you can't talk about the Cuban government being inefficient without putting in the context the U.S. blockade, or then try to say, well, the Cuban government is inefficient, and it would still be inefficient even without the U.S. blockade. How would you know that? You've never seen a Cuban government without the U.S. blockade. Like, think about that. For the history of Cuba's existence, you've never seen a Cuba without U.S. blockade. So what we're seeing, like the accomplishments that they're achieving right now with the vaccines, with actually being able to control the virus for the first like year and a half or so, all of that was done under U.S. blockade, like you said, you know, draining them of like billions, if not millions of dollars.
Yeah, and that you can't have a conversation without providing the context. You can't, and that with all due respect to my friends who aren't as ideologically, let's say, sound, right? And I love them to death. You know, I get into these conversations with my friends all the time, and I say they're basically not basically. They're at war, right? The United States is at war with Cuba, and Cuba doesn't want war. Cuba's like saying, hey, we don't want war. We just want to be left alone, and we want to be part of this global community. And we want to, you have a capitalist country, we have a socialist country. We want the same thing. We want to be able to trade and peacefully coexist, and they can't get that. So you can't say that, well, it's always socialism doesn't work, and they point to the examples and they point to what's happening now without providing the context. But you got to provide the context because that's part of why they're in the condition that they're in. You can't, it's just simple math. So, but yeah, it's pretty maddening because people want to conveniently leave that stuff out. And I always tell people, which Latin American nation has posed a legitimate existential threat to the United States, has tried to invade the United States or fuck with the economy or take their taxpayer dollars to support democracy groups to help overthrow the U.S. government. Like, that doesn't happen. So you know, ask yourself those questions so you can be able to kind of get the big picture. Otherwise, you're missing a big part of this. So, but anyways, all right. So moving right along to the northern region, let's go to Venezuela. So elections will take place in November in Venezuela for regional, mayoral, and gubernatorial seats. Presidente Nicolas Maduro has invited the EU to observe the November 21st elections. And an EU election commission has been formed as part of an exploratory preliminary process to look into the credibility of the electoral process. The opposition is once again considering whether or not to boycott the election. So, so for those on the left, they're going to criticize Maduro for saying, "Hey, why are you getting the EU involved?" I get that position. But then again, I will revert back to my position of try to put yourself in Nicolas Maduro's shoes of trying to get this economy back up and running and trying to change material conditions for the people of Venezuela while you're being attacked left and right by Western forces. And in fact, part of my so here's my next bullet point, and then I'll wait for your response, Nick, is that meanwhile, Maduro continues to make claims in the press and in public that the CIA and the U.S. military is planning to assassinate him. U.S. President Joe Biden continues to support Juan Guaido, saying that the opposition leader is guiding his country through a quote-unquote peaceful democratic transition of power. And this is hilarious to me, but someone actually printed this. I think it was the AP or the Reuters or someone else, some other Western media, that Guaido's term as interim president comes to close at the end of the year. And I will repeat that he is the president of nothing. He's at home, just like me and you right now are, right, Nick. How we're doing this podcast from home. Juan Guaido is home, being president of nothing. He has no institutional power, zero, none. But somehow his presidential term is going to come to end at the end of the year. So I said a lot there. I'll wait for your response.
I wonder if they're going to have an election with Juan Guaido running against someone else. Is that going to be like they're going to have their own separate elections? Or because that's crazy to me that they really said that his term's coming to an end. Like how he really it's not even that he has no power. It's that he has no support, even from the opposition. Like other opposition party members of his own party have abandoned him. They've abandoned the entire U.S. plan to try to overthrow Maduro through this sort of BS, really like half-assed like push, which has just gone nowhere. I think with the Maduro inviting the EU in, that's something they do every election cycle. They invite international election observers, not just from the EU, but from Russia, from China, even from the US. You have certain delegates go. But at the end of the day, what you have is like, despite whatever kind of verification these election observers make, the US and the UK are probably always going to fall back onto the same thing, which is that the elections are unfair. They're not democratic or whatever. I think what's going to be interesting to see this time around, though, is what the opposition does. Because what we've seen since the last attempt to overthrow Maduro is that the opposition in Venezuela is split. Some of them are, done with Guaido. Like I said, they're done with the U.S. sanctions. They just want to try to assimilate back into society, accepting that the Chavismo and the Bolivarian Revolution is there, and dealing with it and trying to win back, popularity and favor that way. Because what we've seen is, like we saw in the last election, like they got wiped, right? The opposition got wiped. They didn't even participate. So of course they're going to get like destroyed. What else was going to happen? So some of them are going to take their route of actually saying, look, we're done with the U.S. trying to do all this for us. On the other hand, I'm sure there's going to be some opposition members who stick with Guaido. And it's going to be interesting to see, which one wins out at the end of the day. Because I don't know. I think that's going to be the most important part of the upcoming elections is which side of the opposition will be more popular and will carry more weight. That'll determine, I think, how the U.S. goes forward and its tactics in dealing with Venezuela in the future. Because after that, if they don't have a majority of even the opposition on their side with the coup, then there's gonna be like no point in even going forward with Guaido. You're gonna have to figure out some other types of strategies to deal with him, or to deal with Maduro. And right now they have no other strategies.
Yeah, and the opposition is completely balkanized and fractured. I mean, they're just all over the place. And what's interesting about that is that they've been receiving support since 1998.
Yeah.
From the United States. So all types of material support, financial support, advisors. I mean, you name it. I mean, the United States has been heavily involved in Venezuelan politics since 1988. And they still don't have their shit together. They can't. There's a bunch of infighting. And meanwhile, the thing that, again, the UN's empire just has a hard time dealing with and grasping is that there is popular support for Chavismo, right? So Chavismo is it's consolidated force, and it's not going anywhere. And so that's the trouble that the U.S. is in when trying to deal with Venezuela. Before we move on to Brazil, just lastly, there was some news, and I saw some videos on social media here and there. There were clashes between state security forces and local gangs that left 26 dead. I'm not going to get too much into that, but the state pretty much declared a victory against some of these groups that were out there, getting involved in illegal criminal activity.
And they were saying that those groups, when they arrested some of them, that a lot of them, at least the Venezuelan government was claiming that they were funded and supported by Colombia and the U.S. They're saying that they captured Colombian and U.S. weapons. I don't know the evidence behind that, but
right. I saw that as well. Yeah. And now moving on to Brazil, a majority of the country now supports impeachment of President Jair Bolsonaro. According to a recent poll, his handling of the pandemic has been widely criticized by those inside Brazil and outside of Brazil. And now new potential scandal alleges that federal officials, and we talked about it, I believe, last week, solicited bribes in exchange for India-based COVID-19 vaccine. And specifically, Roberto Diaz, a former health ministry official, was arrested for being one of those accused bribe seekers in the scandal.
Yeah. So I did actually a thing on Press TV like a week ago about the scandal in India. And it's interesting. I think they said something like, well, how much money? It was like millions of dollars. Like
I didn't get the exact number.
It was something like maybe millions, tens of millions of dollars, which were stolen in essentially like fraud, and laundered to these officials. The impeachment that's being brought up against or that they're talking about against Bolsonaro, I forget the exact, like, the legal term, but essentially the idea is that he put his own private interests above the public interest as a public official. And that's kind of, that's obvious, right? That's pretty much essentially what he's been doing since the beginning of his term. And people are upset, not just if you look at a lot of the protests and what they're saying right now, people are upset about the pandemic. I think that was the boiling point. That was the crisis that pushed people over the edge. But on top of that, people have mentioned issues with the indigenous, essentially the killings of indigenous folks in the Amazon, the continual destruction of the Amazon rainforest, the increase in corruption, police violence and military violence in the streets as they become more repressive. One of the things I mentioned on the program was Bolsonaro is this guy who admires the 1950s military dictatorship of Brazil. He wants to, I think you might have said this before, Vic, but he wants to essentially he wants to redo that. He wants to do that again in his own name. And he's even been talking about, military takeover. And what's interesting, I'm not sure if you have this on the list too, but I think it was like a week or two ago where the head of the CIA went down to Brazil and met with Bolsonaro, and they discussed things like the rising pink tide, the new pink tide in Latin America. The new wave of progressive politicians and such. And so Bolsonaro is someone who is who is a U.S. ally. I'd be curious to see what they do with him. You know, is he like Moise, where he's just too far gone and they gotta just look, you gotta step up, you gotta step away, or is he someone that they're gonna stay attached to and keep in power? Because I think, you know, he's a divisive figure. He's lost almost all support that he's had, even among people who used to support him. I think that they're probably gonna try to get him to step out and not do anything too crazy. But who knows? He's someone who does things on his own terms. You know, he's a military dictator, essentially. That's what he wants to be.
It was fascinating to me to see the juxtaposition between, you know, Dilma Rousseff, the former president, legitimate president of Brazil, who was democratically elected, and this guy Jair Bolsonaro. So just to kind of put this into context, Dilma Rousseff is a former Marxist guerrilla from the 50s, who became a U.S. trained economist, and of course, you know, her ideology changed. She's not the same, romantic revolutionary from the, but again, she represents something in terms of, progressive forces, right? And progressive leading movements in Latin America. And the oligarchs got rid of her, right? After getting rid of Lula, and they replaced her with this guy who fetishizes a white, heterosexual, Brazilian state, right? Militarized state. I mean, this is literally, if you go listen to his speeches and some of the stuff that he said when he came to power, and since then, this is what an anti-science, militarized Brazil is what he fetishizes. A white Brazil, a heterosexual Brazil. I mean, the guy is he's loony. Like, some of the comments that he makes is just like, how did they choose this guy? Like, it wasn't even like, okay, if we're going to get rid of her, let's give, again, this is in the most devious, way of thinking. If you're going to be, that Machiavellian to say, okay, let's get rid of her, but we got to give the people somebody palatable. No, they chose this guy. It's just been an insane ride. It's, it's very similar to when Trump won. I told people, buckle up, because you're going to get 4 years of craziness. And you've gotten a bunch of craziness out of this guy, Jair Bolsonaro. And the fucked up part about it is that, people have died, right? Black Afro Brazilians have died in state crackdowns, because it's very repressive. It's over there in Brazil. And then with the pandemic, I mean, just their handling. I mean, people have died because of, the way the oligarchs have chosen to usurp power and get rid of the, of the Lulas and the Dilma Rousseffs. It's just been crazy.
Right. And it's crazy because people don't mention like just how high that death toll is. Not, in Brazil, even in the US, like over 500,000 now. Like, we're like, that's insane. Like, that's more than most wars that these countries are fighting. And so it's crazy to think like, this at some extent, I wonder to what extent can this person be charged as a
right,
like a war criminal, or like charged in some sort of international court, because it's just the negligence of having so much death on your hands.
right.
Like, it's I don't know. I think it's a serious crime. I'm not sure. Maybe it'll take years for people to see just how serious it is and like actually punish him. But it's crazy to me.
Absolutely. In Colombia now, we know, for months now that we've covered it here. The repressive state of Colombia and the way it's handled the protest. But something I found interesting this week are that journalists are now covering excuse me, an interesting topic, both in and out of Colombia, and that's Colombia's penchant for producing mercenaries. And so El Tiempo, a Colombian-based newspaper, has a recent article titled "Colombian Mercenaries: Trained, Cheap, and Available." And then Reuters, The Guardian, and others ran headlines, covering the topic as well. Colombian mercenaries have now comfortably positioned themselves as some of the most sought out, mercenaries in the world, in a very highly competitive world market that competes with American, Russian, and other mercenaries from around the world. So I just thought that this was interesting, and again, just to provide context from our perspective, is that, again, we want to bash Cuba so much because Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua are so evil, right? Yet we have Colombia, which is literally killing people on the ground as they protest, right? Scores of people, hundreds of people have been disappeared. And now, if it is true that these 28 individuals, Colombian nationals in Haiti, were part of this assassination, and even if it's not, even let's just say, even if you exclude that situation, this is still a legitimate thing, that Colombia is now known as a place where you can go to hire mercenaries to kill, right? And this is what Colombia is producing, and that's our strongest ally in the region. So I just thought it was important to highlight that and highlight the contradictions and highlight our hypocrisy. You know, we want to talk about human rights and democracy and freedom and all this stuff that we that the U.S. Espouses all over the world, and then that's who our ally is in Colombia. All right, that's who our strongest ally is in the region, Colombia. Your thoughts, Nick?
Well, my immediate thought is, it makes sense that you go to Colombia for mercenaries, because what's the one thing that you want from a mercenary, from a soldier, is experience, right? Having that experience is beneficial when hiring like well-trained troops. Colombian, especially paramilitaries, state troops, military, police have great experience. They've been engaged in a 2-3 decade long war with all kinds of guerrilla groups, the FARC. They and against their own people, against indigenous campesino social leaders, activists, like you mentioned right now, what's going on right now, in terms of that repression really is experience for future Colombian mercenaries, and for going to other parts of the world and doing things like we saw in Haiti, like assassinating presidents, right? It's stuff like that that really is what builds the backbone of these mercenaries, right? They're being trained through repression. The repression is their training, and then they can get better jobs. Honestly, the sad part is that too, for a lot of these Colombians, they're probably getting paid more to be mercenaries and go to other parts of the world. And I remember we did a thing at ANTICONQUISTA like maybe a year or two ago, looking at this Colombian mercenary who was participating in the war, I think in Yemen. And they had hired him. He was trained in the U.S. He was trained at like some big academy here in the U.S. And then they sent him to Dubai, trained him in Dubai in terms of like how to fight in the desert, and then sent him down into Yemen to fight with the Saudis as a mercenary. And it's crazy because that was, a lot of them were saying, this is the best job, this is the best pay I've gotten since I've started working in any kind of military or police institution. But yeah, that's, this is, they train them through repressing the left. After the repression of the left, that's their training. Then they go out and they'll fight against anti-imperialists all throughout the world. It's a network that they're building. It's an international network. I think it just goes to show that the struggle that we're fighting is an international struggle. It's not going to be people from, it's going to be people from the U.S. who we're fighting against, but it's also going to be people from other parts of the world who they had trained through repressing their own people, who are going to collectively come together and fight against a global anti-imperialist movement.
When you juxtaposition that with, and let's go to Cuba, the vanguard. If you study the Cuban history of the Cuban Revolutionary War against Batista, in time and again, you'll read in the documents how the Cuban guerrillas had heart on their side. They were fighting with an idea. They were fighting about ideas. Meanwhile, the military dictatorship of Batista, they were there to essentially repress the population. They were there to keep things in order. They weren't really trying to die for an idea. They were just taking their marching orders, and they were afraid to die. It was the opposite. The Cuban revolutionaries had no fear of death because they were fighting for an idea, and the military dictatorship were afraid of dying, and they were there to just be repressive and just to kind of keep everything up. And they lost, right? And then after the revolutionaries took power in 1959, It's just anytime they got involved, with any type of military, let's say solidarity with others, whether it was Angola or other parts of the world, it was in true acts of solidarity. These weren't mercenaries, Cuba and Fidel Castro felt that they had a debt to pay to Africa, so they sent troops to Africa. They wasn't like, okay, well, let's send troops to Africa and in return we want money, right? Or we're gonna send military troops in return for something else. No, it was a true act of solidarity. So I think it's just important to sort of juxtaposition, the Cuba example, and then the Colombia example, right? So it's just an unbelievable situation with again what's happened in Haiti, and if this is true even if exclude that, again, this has become a thing now in the Western press. They're like, oh, wait a minute, Colombia has all these mercenaries. Like, they're just now starting to find out, like, oh wait, what's going on in Colombia with all these mercenaries.
It's crazy because too, like, how much has the Western media covered the protests in Colombia, which are still going on right now?
Right.
Instead, they're talking about the mercenaries that could
Right.
be beneficial to the military-industrial complex.
Right.
It's wild.
Right. Absolutely. So lastly, and we're about to finish up here, in Peru, the elections has still yet to be certified in Peru. People did take to the streets because they want a president. They want to officially be told that they have a president. It's presumed that Pedro Castillo is the winner, and he has recently declared that he will have a hybrid administration of what he called technocrats and political allies, suggesting his economy will be market friendly. So he's sort of kind of like not sort of he's trying to assure the business community that hey, we're not moving towards another quote unquote Venezuela or another Cuba or something like that. So I don't know your thoughts before we end.
It's crazy, man, because he won the election. They couldn't even hide or cover up the fact that he won the election. They couldn't even say like manipulate the numbers like they did like they have done in other countries. And it was that was the first thing that came to my mind. The second thing that came to my mind was, and even after he won the election, he's been throwing bones. He's been giving these reassurances to the right and to the center, basically, to the capitalists, saying like, look, I'm not gonna be as radical as you make me out to be. And even then, they can't even certify or ratify the election. They can't do anything for him. They're not giving him any assurances or anything like that. It's crazy because these are the same people who say that they care about the people of Peru, or they'll care about, it's like the opposition in Venezuela. They claim to care about the people of Venezuela and they represent the people. Yet these are the ones who are willing to throw their own nation, their own communities into complete chaos and endanger the lives of their people just for them to have some sort of power and to have some sort of reassurance for the big business class in their country. So, this is really, I think you talked about this maybe a couple episodes ago, but this is what like we've been fighting against, is that no matter what we do in terms of the electoral field, no matter what we give or compromise with the opposition for, they're never going to be, they're always going to be scared. They're always going to try to threaten us. They're always going to try to like do all these things, go as far as calling for foreign military intervention in the country just to make sure that they have power. And this is what we're seeing right now with Peru. It's insane that it's been over a month and they still haven't certified an election, which they don't have any arguments against. They can't even come out and be like, nah, he didn't win. All their arguments got thrown out. So it's like, what are they doing at this point?
The wealthy, the oligarchs, the ruling class, they want a complete monopoly and dictatorship on the political processes and the economy. And if they don't have that, they start freaking out. It's not, they don't want to give up an inch. They want to be able to control the and they've been in control for forever, basically, right? So they don't want to give up any of that control. And then it's just crazy because then they go to the press and they create this narrative, and then they wage these information, misinformation campaigns, and it's all propaganda, simply because all of a sudden, when people become part of the political process and start to democratize the economy just a little bit, slightly, because we're not talking about liquidating, not like what they did in Cuba, which is liquidating the complete bourgeoisie and saying like, no, this is going to be a workers and farmers and revolutionaries, state dictatorship. We're not talking about that, but just the idea of a progressive or someone who's trying to, get some sort of concession out of the economy, right? And out of the oligarch, they can't grasp that. They can't deal with that. And they don't want to let it go. So it's unbelievable how that goes. But yeah, so in Peru, while we have a presumptive winner,
one thing I want to add too is that
hasn't been certified yet.
Yeah, one thing I think is interesting too, though, is how often that backfires on them. Like immediately right after the election, there was the claim. Like I think it was Keiko Fujimori who made all these claims that Castillo didn't win, and that there was like, I think one of the things she said was that they were stuffing ballot boxes filled with like a bunch of Castillo votes. And then it turned out, I think a couple weeks after that, they arrested someone for doing that for Fujimori. Like it's crazy because they really got no evidence. They have no support, and what they're doing is by delaying the certification of the election, or delaying like by calling it for Castillo, they're forcing people to take to the streets, right? They are the right wing, the opposition in many of these countries is radicalizing the left, right? Is radicalizing the otherwise progressive, otherwise folks who don't want to be in the streets, who just want to go to work, want to live their regular days, who like regular lives, who don't want violence, who don't want to have to be fighting. The repression of the right is radicalizing that population. They're like undermining themselves. We saw this in Venezuela, right? It was not only the organizing of the Chavistas, which won over a vast majority of the people, but it was also the fact that the right wing was so dedicated to destroying, to attacking, and to trying to demonize the Bolivarian revolution. That really forced people to say, look, I'm not going to accept that, and I'm going to go take to the streets and fight against that. So I think that's interesting. A lot of these strategies are kind of working against the right wing, and I think that's one of the reasons why we're seeing such a strong wave of like social democratic and socialist candidates taking over Latin American countries.
Yeah, someone just posted a comment saying, I know Peruvians who are making arguments against, they claim there was a lot of fraud and Castillo didn't win, what you were just saying. So just, and I'm not, look, I've always said, look, I'm not an academic, I'm not an intellectual, I'm not a historian. The elections were basically almost split. It was, he won by her, like it was just, he didn't win by much.
Yeah.
My understanding of, Peru, the Peruvian people and the politics there, it tends to be very conservative. In fact, I believe this is the first time they've ever had in their history. I believe this is the first time they've ever had a left-leaning leader in its entire post-colonial history. I could be wrong. Someone could fact check that. But this is what I heard in a recent interview from a Peruvian activist. That being said, I will say, let me just say a couple things. One, I don't believe, I only believe in democracy and in quote unquote free elections or elections under certain parameters, basically. If you were to tell me, like in Cuba, I believe in their elections because it's under the dictatorship of a revolutionary socialist state government. Those are the elections that I believe. I don't think there's anything more democratic than a revolutionary socialist dictatorship. So I'm very clear on that position, that I don't believe in, when I hear free and fair elections for whom? What are we talking about? This idea of the bourgeoisie peacefully coexisting with the poor and working class, and this, in this, conjured up imaginary world of where everybody kumbaya go to the polls, and somehow we're going to make magic work through some type of electoral it's nonsense. Now, that being said, leftists use the electoral process in Latin America because of the hit. We got to put this into context. We use that because our people are tired of bloodshed. So yeah, we could, ideally, as from a very romantic, idealistic way of how to take over the state would be through arms, through revolutionary armed struggle. A lot of our people don't want that. All right. And that's very complicated. That's what they did in Cuba. That's how they were able to liquidate the bourgeoisie. That's not, and Fidel Castro has made speeches about this where he said, look, our process was our process. Your process is going to be your process. What you do in your country is going to be a little bit different than what we do in our country. So, I look at the electoral process as just a chess move, a political chess move on our part to be able to inch closer to taking over certain state institutions. My hope for something, I'll give it the two examples right now are Venezuela and Nicaragua, where we should, the left needs to figure out real revolutionary socialists in Venezuela need to figure out how to completely penetrate and take over every single state institution. All right. And then slowly through decades and however long it takes, slowly liquidate the bourgeoisie by playing chess, and what does that mean by playing chess? You have to deal with the US, you have to deal with the wealthy. The more you empower poor and working class people through certain mechanisms, through certain levers, you could slowly, let those fucking people just leave Venezuela and get tired of the people with the wealth and the money. Let them fucking leave Venezuela. Let them go to Miami. Let them go to the UK. Let them slowly leave Venezuela as you continue to empower poor and working class people. As you continue to empower Afro-Venezolanos. In Nicaragua, it's the same thing. So now the Chavistas and the Ortegas, of the world, they need to continue to consolidate power. And continue to figure out how to empower their working class, their farmers, their peasants, the LGBT community, so on and so forth. But the electoral process is something that we use as a vehicle to get to a place, as opposed to picking up, and guess what? It's going to happen at some point where maybe Puerto Rico is one of those places. I don't know, but it's going to happen. Or maybe even, in Colombia, it's been an interesting thing. But at some point, you may have another Cuba where people say, fuck the electoral process. We're going to have to pick up the gun. Okay. But that's what I would just say. That's my long-winded answer to the response of, I know some Peruvians who are making the argument. My response is, I don't care. I hope that Castillo becomes the certified winner so we can inch a step closer towards socialism. I'll wait for thoughts, Nick. I don't know if you agree with any of that, but those are my thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's well put. I mean, I agree in terms of how you understand the electoral process and elections. And I would say, a lot of that armed struggle, part of it, I think we're seeing the initial stages of it in Colombia. It's a question of whether that will continue or how that will develop. And I think we've also seen parts of that armed struggle in other places throughout the world, in Yemen as the first place I think of. And in terms of actually listening to people who say things like there's fraud in this country, or there's whatever in this country, you hear those claims all the time. There's always going to be people who say that the elections weren't fair in whatever country. Why are there going to be people who say that? Well, because there's always going to be losers, right? And we hear Venezuelans who are part of the opposition or who are just right-wing, Venezuelans living in the U.S., who say that kind of stuff all the time. And so at the end of the day, a lot of it is you had to question, well, what evidence is there for that? Because if there's no evidence for it, then it's a fabricated argument that means absolutely nothing. It's just something that people put out there just to sow the seeds of doubt in our minds. Just like how people are putting out the SOS Colombia or SOS Cuba right now to sow the seeds of doubt that the Cuban government has actually been efficient in fighting against the pandemic. The reality is that the Cuban government has been extremely efficient in fighting against the pandemic. But if you make a claim nowadays with the internet, you can just make a claim, and you just got to put that idea in people's minds, and whether or not there's evidence for it, some people will immediately latch on and believe it. maybe that's because they already are predisposed to dislike some government or some individual or some ideology. Well, that's fine. That's how, that's how it's going to be. That's how the world works. You're not going to win everyone over. In terms of the hard like facts of that kind of like people who say that kind of stuff, the reality is that that's not a good argument, because the exit polls before the Peruvian election showed that Castillo was going to win by a landslide. And then quickly, as the election came closer and closer, what they ended up seeing was that, well, now those exit polls turned out to be completely wrong. Keiko Fujimori was in the lead for the first couple of days, right? Then they started tallying the votes from the countryside, and they showed that Castillo got a slight win, a slight lead over Fujimori. And it's funny because when you compare the results to the exit polls, or to like the predictions that were made before the election, it showed that Castillo was way ahead. So the real question should be, how did someone who was way ahead suddenly have like only a slight victory over Fujimori? And again, that goes back to what I said earlier, which is that they found out a lot, like there was like ballot stuffing, but not in favor of Castillo, in favor of Fujimori. There was some fraud that was committed, but that was on the side of Fujimori, not on the side of Castillo. And since then, really, like a lot of those claims of fraud, a lot of those claims of whatever like kind of mishaps or something that happened during the election, a lot of them have kind of quieted and died down. It's now become mostly like just blanket attacks against communism. Like communism is bad. We don't want communism in Peru. We don't want to end up like Venezuela. We don't want to end up like Cuba. And that's why now you're seeing Castillo and the Peru Libre Party put out all of these messages of, right, oh, well, we're gonna appease, we're gonna have a market-friendly government, we're gonna have opposition take part in the government. So, I think a lot of those arguments of fraud have kind of been dispelled and disproven already, and they're not like the main arguments anymore. The main arguments now are just that he's gonna like ruin the country, and they're responding to that.
Absolutely. Well, folks, I think that's going to be a wrap. I mean, we're going now into like a little over an hour and 10 minutes. I've been seeing some of the comments here, and we didn't get to a particular question. I'm on Facebook. You can hit me up. You can hit us up on ANTICONQUISTA, the ANTICONQUISTA platform at Facebook. But we appreciate everybody's support. We appreciate everybody tuning in. Please share, please like, please subscribe. And we're going to be here every week, hopefully, doing this. We think this is important work. Again, and we're trying to tie, what the 60 million Latinos that are living here in the diaspora, in at least in the United States. Of course, I don't know what the figures are in the UK. I'd be curious. We got to talk to Conrad Carlos about that. He needs to look into some census data for us. And tie those 60 million Latinos, or at least a good segment of those 60 million Latinos, to the revolutionary global South. And so we appreciate you folks. Let's keep this movement moving. And we hope everybody has a great rest of your Sunday. Peace.
See you.